Here's a reason they call it the wild. In the far corners of the Pacific Northwest, where the fog swallows entire mountains and the forests hum with whispers older than time, things move that shouldn't exist. Campers vanish without a trace. Rangers refuse to patrol certain trails after dark. And locals speak of voices in the trees, calling them by name. Tonight, verified fear takes you beyond the map, into 11 true stories that defy explanation, challenge belief, and prove one thing. Out here, the forest remembers everything. What would you do if you realized the fog rolling through the forest wasn't just moving with the wind, but following you? And what if, every time you stopped to catch your breath, you heard footsteps inside it getting closer? I've hiked the Olympic Peninsula my entire life. Grew up in Port Angeles, spent my weekends on these trails before I could even drive. I know these forests like most people know their own neighborhood, which is why what happened to me last November still doesn't make any goddamn sense. I'm telling you this because I need someone to believe me, and because I need to know if anyone else has experienced what I did on the Hoh River Trail that day. It started as a perfect hiking day. I'd taken a personal day from work specifically to get out before the heavy winter rain set in. The forecast called for partly cloudy skies, no precipitation, temperatures in the low 50s, ideal conditions. I hit the trailhead around 2 in the afternoon, planning a quick 8-mile out and back before sunset. The parking lot was empty, which wasn't unusual for a Wednesday in November. Tourist season was over, and the locals were mostly at work. I prefer it that way. The solitude is half the reason I hike. The first 3 miles were exactly what I expected. The Hoh rainforest in autumn is something else entirely. Massive Sitka spruces draped in moss, the air thick with that earthy smell of decomposition and growth happening simultaneously. Everything is green, on green, on green. So saturated, it almost hurts your eyes. The trail was muddy but manageable, and I was making good time. I'd seen a Roosevelt elk about a mile in, a few Steller's jays harassing each other in the canopy. Normal, peaceful, exactly what I needed after a brutal week at the office. I noticed the fog around mile marker 4. That itself wasn't strange. Fog is common in the rainforest, rolling in from the coast or forming in the valleys when the temperature drops. But this fog was different. It appeared suddenly, maybe 50 or 60 yards behind me on the trail, a solid wall of white that seemed far too dense for the weather conditions. I stopped and watched it for a moment, checking my weather app to see if conditions had changed. Nothing. Still partly cloudy, no fog advisory, no marine layer warnings. I kept walking, occasionally glancing back. The fog maintained its distance, always the same gap between us, maybe 50 yards, never closer, never farther. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just noticing it because I'd happened to look back at the right time. Fog doesn't follow people. Fog is water vapor governed by temperature, humidity, air pressure. It's meteorology, not something with intent. But then I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle, and the fog stopped too. I could see where it ended, a perfectly defined line across the trail, which isn't how fog works. Fog dissipates gradually. It doesn't have edges like a wall. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, and the fog didn't advance or retreat. It just waited. My heart rate picked up. I started walking again, faster this time, and yes, I checked behind me. The fog resumed its movement, maintaining that exact same distance. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was a temperature gradient, a specific atmospheric condition creating a localized fog bank that happened to be moving at the same pace I was walking. It sounded stupid even in my head. But the alternative was worse. I decided to test it. I stopped abruptly and spun around, watching the fog. It took maybe 3 or 4 seconds, but it stopped. Then I heard the footsteps. Not the sound of wind rustling through the fog, not an animal moving through underbrush. Footsteps, human footsteps, boot on trail, that specific sound of someone walking toward you. They came from inside the fog, measured and steady, and they stopped when the fog stopped. Every rational part of my brain was screaming explanations at me. Another hiker I hadn't seen. Sound carrying strangely through the dense forest, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. But I've been hiking alone for 20 years. I know what fear sounds like when it's trying to disguise itself as logic. I ran. Not jogging, not speed walking, full sprint. My backpack bounced against my spine, my water bottle fell out of the side pocket, and I didn't stop to grab it. The trail blurred beneath my feet. Roots and rocks I normally would have carefully navigated became obstacles I barely registered. My lungs burned in the cold air. Behind me, I could hear it. The fog was moving faster. Not impossibly fast, but faster than fog should move, faster than wind could push it. And underneath that sound, or maybe inside it, those footsteps matched my pace. Running now? Chasing. I don't know how long I ran. Time does weird things when you're terrified. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My legs were screaming, my throat raw from gasping in the cold air. I risked a glance backward and immediately wished I hadn't. The fog had closed some of the distance. It was maybe 30 yards behind me now, and it was darker than before, less like normal fog and more like smoke, thick and substantial. And the footsteps weren't just behind me anymore. They were on both sides, parallel to me in the forest, pacing me through the trees. That's when I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. I was running deeper into the wilderness, farther from the trailhead, farther from my car, farther from any possibility of help. But turning around would mean running toward it, through it. And every instinct I had was screaming that going into that fog was not an option I would survive. I spotted a game trail splitting off from the main path and made a split-second decision. I veered right, crashing through sword ferns and salal, branches whipping across my face. The game trail was barely visible, probably made by elk, and it led uphill away from the river. My thighs burned as I climbed, using roots and exposed rocks to pull myself up the steep incline. I didn't hear the footsteps anymore, just my own breathing and the sound of vegetation thrashing against my jacket. I climbed for what felt like forever before I finally stopped. Pressing my back against a massive Sitka spruce, trying to quiet my breathing enough to listen. The forest was silent. Not peaceful silent. Wrong silent. No birds, no wind, no distant sound of the river. Just my breathing and my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then I smelled it. Salt, water, and something else. Decay. But not the normal forest decomposition smell. Something older. Something that reminded me of the beach after a storm, when dead things wash up from the deep. The smell was getting stronger, and with it came that impossible fog, seeping through the trees, rising up from the forest floor like it was emerging from the ground itself. I abandoned any pretense of understanding what was happening and just moved. Not running anymore because the terrain was too rough, but scrambling, climbing, putting as much elevation between myself and that thing as I could manage. My hands were bleeding from grabbing rough bark and sharp rocks. My ankle rolled at least twice, but adrenaline kept me moving. The fog kept rising. It filled the spaces between trees, erasing the forest behind me, and the footsteps came with it. closer now. I could hear breathing inside the fog, rhythmic and wet like something dragging air through fluid-filled lungs. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. I don't know how I found the logging road. Pure luck, maybe, or whatever passes for divine intervention when you're being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. One moment I was crashing through old-growth forest, the next I stumbled onto gravel. A decommissioned logging road, probably decades old, but it was clear and it ran perpendicular to the slope. I turned left for no reason other than instinct and ran along that road like my life depended on it. It probably did. The fog didn't follow me onto the road. I made it maybe 100 yards before I realized I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. Couldn't smell that terrible ocean rot smell. I stopped and turned around. The fog had stopped at the tree line, that same sharp edge, that same impossible boundary. It stayed there, roiling and dense, for maybe 30 seconds. Then it retreated. Not dissipated. Retreated. It pulled back into the forest deliberately, purposefully, like something giving up a hunt it knew it had lost. I walked that logging road for 3 miles before it intersected with a Forest Service road. Flagged down a ranger truck just before full dark. Told them I'd gotten turned around, which was technically true. They drove me back to the trailhead. My car was the only one there, waiting right where I'd left it 5 hours earlier. I've tried to find that logging road on maps. It's not there. The game trail I followed shouldn't have led to anything but deeper forest. The fog bank that day wasn't mentioned in any weather reports. I checked. I've talked to meteorologists, experienced hikers, even a physics professor at the university. No one has an explanation that makes sense. I haven't been back to the Hoh River Trail. I probably never will. Because sometimes the forest reminds you that you're not at the top of the food chain, that there are older things than us in these woods, and some of them are still hungry. What if the wilderness itself turned on you, erasing every track, every mark, and left you questioning reality with each step? If the trail you set your life by vanished beneath your boots, leaving only your own footprints as a mocking echo, would you keep walking? Or would you turn back into the unknown? I'm not easily shaken. Years spent mapping logging roads and game trails across Washington have given me an almost pathological trust in my Garmin, my old map books, and my own instincts. This trust is exactly why I find myself haunted long after my last trek into the Cascades. Haunted not by what I saw, but by the slow, insidious way reality peeled itself away mile by mile, until all that was left were questions. A seasoned hiker, an already anxious mind, and a wilderness that decided my confidence was an open invitation. I planned the trip meticulously. 2 days solo between Snoqualmie Pass and a disused firewatch cabin, tracing what should have been a series of mapped switchbacks up and into old growth. Weather forecast was cold, clear, no snow risk, just the perpetual damp every Pacific Northwest explorer knows by heart. I watched the sunrise beside the parking lot as I shouldered my pack, checked my gear 3 times, and started into the woods, boots crunching on frozen earth. The forest felt almost welcoming, light streaming between frayed branches and thick trunks, the hush of civilization replaced with that particular orchestra of distant streams and bird calls. The only company I expected was the squirrel chattering above, and maybe, far off, the echoing notes of an owl waiting for nightfall. The first couple miles were perfect. Ordinary in that way the truly wild places can be. Just enough risk to keep you sharp. Just enough beauty to keep you humble. At marker 2, the trail was as clear as it had been on every map. Wide enough in places to drive a truck through, switchbacks visible, moss and fallen branches offering familiar obstacles. When I reached a fork where my GPS insisted left, led into dense brush, and my old paper map promised a trail, I shrugged away the digital confusion. Old logging traces disappear all the time. Maps, especially print, sometimes preserve ghosts as well as reality. Except after 15 minutes, the ghost became something much stranger. The trail I chose was real. Fresh, crushed pine needles, boot prints, sometimes deer tracks. Every few yards, the forest looked subtly off. The way fallen limbs were stacked felt almost purposeful, and the sunlight seemed to narrow. Still, I trusted my map, clicked my tongue at the stubbornness of my GPS, and pushed on. The sense of being watched was so faint, I only noticed it by its absence. The forest oddly devoid of the racket I'd come to expect. Even the rodents seemed to be holding their breath. 3 miles in, the trail suddenly opened on what should have been a broad clearing marked as a decommissioned campsite. Where fire rings and faded signposts usually stood, there was nothing. Just pine needles and silence. But that's not what unsettled me. What made my hands shake was the pattern of boot prints that edged the clearing. They matched my own boots, down to the odd abrasion near the left toe, a mark I'd made scraping up hawthorn near my house 2 weeks before. The air grew colder, heavier. I looked around, heart thudding not from exertion, but from a sickly sense. I was the only person who'd been here in years, yet every path leading out was marked with impressions, deep and fresh, identical to mine. I retraced my steps, checking each exit from the clearing with a flashlight and my phone. No human tracks older than mine, no animal prints, just the distinct echo, a familiar gait. I spat out a bitter laugh at the thought of someone stalking me with rubber overlays to match my boots. But the joke died flat as the wind. Moving in with purpose felt like the only sane thing to do. I followed the only clear trail heading east, trying not to look at the matching footprints that now appeared in clusters every 10 yards. My GPS was no help. It displayed green terrain with nothing but blank white where my route should have been. At every turn, it offered corrections, looping me back in on myself, suggesting I'd wandered off a mapped fire road. I tried my old map, only to find jagged pen lines crossing routes, as though someone had gone over them with a shaky hand, all while my real trail pressed forward as confidently as any old logging path. I stopped at a fallen log to rest and collect myself, fighting the urge to call a friend, knowing cell service was long gone. I tried marking my location by carving a circle in the trunk. When I rose to move on, another circle stared back at me from the next tree, still damp, recently cut, matching my own down to the quirky twist I always did at the end. I was further unnerved by the silence that followed me. No birds, no distant rush of wind, just my breath and the oddly loud sound of boots compressing loam. At one point, I ducked into a thicket to pee, then stopped cold when I saw a line of broken branches ahead, tracing the exact shape of my own path. No prints but my own. No sounds but my own. Even my cough seemed to echo back, thinner, less certain than it should have been. By noon, I reached a ridge where I could actually see the surrounding valleys. I expected the familiar outline, the fire watch cabin or the old clearing where a Forest Service truck should sit. What I saw instead was, impossibly, another hiker. Broad-shouldered, tan jacket, black pack, mirroring exactly what I wore, standing on the far side of the ridge, not moving. I waved. Nothing. I called out. No response. Instead, the figure squatted, tracing something in the dirt with its hand, and then rose, vanishing as quickly as a dropped cigarette. I hurried over, anxious for contact, just to find more boot prints matching my own and another odd circle, carved into the hardpan with just a twist at the end. I tried to backtrack, but the way was blocked by dense brush, so thick it wasn't there before. The trail behind seemed to dissolve, replaced with rough forest, as if the earth decided it was done hosting human feet. I kept moving, following the only direction where ground was still clear, boots pounding out my increasing panic. At each turn, more of my own footprints appeared, weaving between fallen logs and sometimes marking places I never walked. The world closed in. It became impossible to judge distance or direction except by sun, which was fast vanishing in the ever-thickening clouds. Even the warmth I'd felt that morning gave way to icy damp. The forest's colors dulled, trees leaning in drunken angles, until I felt like I was walking through an underexposed photo. The only thing consistent was the echo of my own movement, the crunch of my boots and the dull ache of my knees. Time warped. Minutes felt like hours, every loop bringing me back to the same cluster of circles and boot marks. I reached a point where I realized I couldn't tell if I'd ever left the initial clearing. Had I wandered in circles for hours, or had the forest rearranged itself each time I took a step? My gear, checked so carefully that morning, felt heavier now, as though the pack itself resisted movement. Every ration bar, every map, every knife was useless. I slumped against a tree, face cold against rough bark, and allowed myself to weep openly, raw, helpless, furious at myself and at a forest that seemed intent on turning even my most confident footsteps into a mocking echo. When night finally approached, I knew I couldn't camp. The idea of sleeping in a place where every sound reflected my own voice, every track matched my own, was unbearable. I pressed onward, determined only to keep moving until something broke, either my legs or whatever spell the world had decided to cast. Then, as the temperature plunged and the last light drained from the sky, I stumbled onto a marked trail. Not the one I'd planned, nor the one my GPS indicated, but a wide, crushed gravel trail with a signpost more recent than anything I'd seen all day. My pack felt suddenly lighter, my boots less burdensome. The forest relaxed its grip, noises returning in hesitant waves. Distant bird calls, a gust of wind. I sprinted that last mile, legs numb, heart thumping as reality stitched itself back together one step at a time. When I burst into the parking lot, my truck sat in the deep blue dusk, as if waiting for someone else. It took a full hour before I could drive, hands shaking, breath hitching in my chest. I checked my phone. No new messages, no weird GPS tracks. I checked my boots, still marked by that hawthorn scrape. But when I looked under the soles, there was a new indentation. A perfect circle, carved deep, twisting just the way I always finish. A detail no map, no GPS, no memory could explain. For weeks after, I tried to rationalize what happened. I spoke to rangers, with no luck. I went over satellite images, finding nothing amiss. But every time I laced up my boots, I caught myself glancing down, half expecting to see circles staring up, half willing myself not to find any new tracks behind me. I haven't returned to the Cascades, not because I fear what happened, but because I fear what didn't. It's the uncertainty, the perfect imitation, the knowledge that some places can strip you of every certainty, leaving you alone with only yourself, and the footsteps that insist you are never truly alone. So if you ever find yourself lost, pursued only by your own echo in the woods, trust your instincts. But know this: not every path wants to be followed, and not every echo is yours alone. Some trails, some forests, remember us all too well. I'm a scientist. I deal in facts, measurements, observable phenomena. I don't believe in ghosts, cryptids, or anything that can't be explained through rational inquiry. At least, I didn't. But after 6 nights camped alone near Mount Rainier, watching those rock cairns multiply around my tent with mathematical precision, I've had to reconsider what constitutes rational thought. This is my account, written exactly as it happened, because documentation is all I have left to prove I'm not losing my mind. My name is Adriana, and I'm a volcanologist specializing in glacial retreat patterns. I was conducting a solo research trip to document ice loss on the Emmons Glacier, which required establishing a base camp at approximately 9,000 feet, well above the tree line, in an area that sees maybe a dozen visitors per year outside climbing season. I chose late September specifically because the weather window was closing, and I needed uninterrupted time for measurements. The solitude was a feature, not a bug. I've done this work for 11 years, across 3 continents. I'm comfortable alone. I'm methodical. I follow protocols. Day 1 was textbook. I hiked in with 50 pounds of equipment, set up my tent on a flat saddle with clear sight lines in all directions, and spent the afternoon taking initial measurements. The landscape up there is stark, almost lunar. Gray volcanic rock, patches of stubborn alpine vegetation, and the massive white bulk of the glacier dominating the eastern horizon. The air was thin and cold, the sky that deep alpine blue that makes you feel like you're standing on the edge of space. I ate a freeze-dried meal, documented the day's work in my field journal, and fell asleep to the sound of distant ice cracking as the glacier shifted in the night. I woke on day 2 to find a single cairn 10 feet from my tent. 5 rocks stacked in a neat pyramid, each stone carefully balanced. I documented it with photos, measurements, GPS coordinates. My first thought was another researcher or a climber passing through, though I'd seen no one and the nearest established route was miles away. The rocks were local basalt, nothing unusual about them except their arrangement. I noted it in my journal and went about my work, spending the day at the glacier face taking core samples and temperature readings. That night, I made a point of scanning the area before bed. No cairns except the original. Clear sky, temperature dropping to the low 20s, frost forming on the tent fly. I sealed myself in, and read for an hour by headlamp, then slept. Day 3, 2 cairns. The original was still there, untouched. The new one sat 15 feet away on the opposite side of my tent. 6 rocks this time, stacked with the same careful precision. I felt the first flutter of unease, but I'm trained to observe before concluding. I spent an hour examining both cairns, looking for footprints, disturbed ground, any sign of human presence. The volcanic soil was hard-packed and showed nothing. I set up my trail camera facing the tent perimeter, checked the batteries twice, and made sure the motion sensor was functioning. Whatever was building these cairns would be documented. The day's work took me 3 miles across a rough terrain to a secondary measurement site. I returned exhausted as the sun dropped behind Rainier's western shoulder, casting the entire basin into deep shadow. 3 cairns now formed a rough triangle around my tent, each one containing 7 rocks. The trail camera showed nothing. I reviewed every frame, 8 hours of footage showing only the tent, the rocks, and occasional small birds. No people, no animals large enough to move stones, just empty frames. And then suddenly, between one frame and the next, the 3rd cairn appeared. No transition, no movement, just absence, and then presence. I'm ashamed to admit I considered leaving. But I'm also stubborn, and the scientist in me needed an explanation. Weather phenomenon? Seismic activity causing rocks to tumble into formations? I knew both ideas were absurd, even as I wrote them in my journal. Rocks don't stack themselves in perfect pyramids. They don't appear in the 3-second gap between trail camera captures. Day 4. 4 cairns, 8 rocks each. They formed a square now, one at each cardinal direction, all equidistant from my tent. I hadn't heard anything during the night. No footsteps, no sounds of rocks scraping. The trail camera again showed nothing useful, just the moment between frames where reality reorganized itself. I spent that day barely working, mostly sitting on a rock outcropping 300 yards away, watching my camp through binoculars. Nothing moved. The wind picked up in the afternoon, strong enough that I had to secure my tent with additional stakes. But the cairn stood unmoved, impossibly stable. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my tent with the flap partially open, headlamp off, watching the darkness. The stars were overwhelming at that altitude, the Milky Way so bright it cast faint shadows. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. Not footsteps, not wind. A sound like rocks clicking together, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from all 4 directions at once. I grabbed my spotlight and flooded the area with light. 5 cairns now, the new one directly in front of my tent entrance. 9 rocks. I'd been watching. I'd been listening. It appeared anyway. Day 5. 6 cairns. 10 rocks each. They formed a circle now, with my tent at the center, each cairn precisely placed like points on a compass. I'd stopped pretending this was natural. I documented everything with photographs, detailed notes, GPS coordinates. I checked my altimeter obsessively, wondering if oxygen deprivation was causing hallucinations. But my blood oxygen levels were normal. I was eating, hydrating, following every protocol. The cairns were real. The camera footage continued to show their impossible appearances, 3-second gaps, where the laws of cause and effect seemed suspended. I tried to knock one down. The rocks wouldn't budge. They weren't cemented or glued. But when I tried to lift the top stone from the nearest cairn, it felt fixed, immovable, as if the rocks had fused into a single mass. I tried another cairn with the same result. Whatever force was building these structures had made them permanent, or at least beyond my ability to dismantle. Day 6. 7 cairns. 11 rocks each. A new one had appeared inside the circle, just 5 feet from my tent door. The circle was tightening. For the first time, I felt genuine fear. Not the intellectual unease of unexplained phenomena, but visceral, animal fear. I was being counted toward something, some end point that would arrive when the numbers reached their conclusion. I knew I should leave, hike out immediately. But I needed to see it through. Scientists observe. We document. We don't run from data just because it frightens us. That night I lay in my tent, not even pretending I might sleep, waiting for the sound of rocks clicking into place. It came at midnight exactly, my watch alarm coinciding with that rhythmic clicking. I counted the sounds. 12 distinct clicks, 12 rocks finding their arrangement. I didn't turn on my light. I didn't look. I just listened and counted and tried to keep my breathing steady. Day 7. 8 cairns, 12 rocks each. The new one was 2 feet from my tent. I could touch it from the entrance. The circle had become a spiral, winding inward. And at the rate of 1 cairn per night, tomorrow's would be close enough to block my door. I broke camp in a frenzy, stuffing gear into my pack without my usual organization, abandoning equipment I couldn't carry. I needed distance, needed to be anywhere but inside that tightening spiral. I made it maybe 30 yards before I saw them. Rocks scattered across the ground in front of me, hundreds of them, all similar size, all waiting. Behind me, I heard that clicking sound, but it was wrong, too fast, not the slow, methodical pace of previous nights. I turned and saw all 8 cairns collapsing simultaneously, rocks tumbling and rolling, but not falling randomly. They rolled toward me, gathering speed, and then they stopped, just stopped, scattered in patterns that formed numbers, dates, coordinates, mathematical sequences I recognized from my own research data. I ran with 50 pounds on my back, ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, ran until the alpine basin was behind me, and I dropped below the tree line into blessed forest, where rocks stayed on the ground like they were supposed to. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, nearly 12 miles. A hike that should have taken 6 hours compressed into 3 by pure adrenaline and terror. The rangers were kind. They listened to my story with the careful attention people use when they're worried about your mental state. They offered to retrieve my abandoned equipment. But when they hiked up 3 days later, they found nothing. No cairns, no camera, no scattered rocks forming patterns. Just an empty campsite and wind-scoured volcanic soil that looked undisturbed for years. I still have my journal, my photographs, and the trail camera footage I'd transferred to my phone each night. The images are there, undeniable, time-stamped and GPS tagged. 8 cairns in a spiral, 12 rocks each. But I also have the final entry I don't remember writing, dated for day 8 in handwriting that looks like mine but isn't quite right. It just says 13 over and over, filling 3 pages, the numbers getting larger and more frantic. I've tried to find explanations. Sleep deprivation, altitude sickness, some kind of fugue state. But the data doesn't lie, and I'm left with documentation of something that shouldn't exist, arranged in patterns that suggested intention, counting towards something I'm grateful I didn't stay to witness. I haven't returned to alpine research. I work in labs now, where rocks stay in labeled containers and nothing rearranges itself in the night. Some phenomena aren't meant to be observed. Some counts aren't meant to reach their conclusion. And some places in the wilderness operate on mathematics we were never meant to understand. You ever been underground when you realize the Earth isn't as dead as you thought? I'm talking real underground. Not some tourist cave with handrails and mood lighting. I'm talking miles of darkness where your headlamp is the only star in an ancient universe that predates human existence by millennia. That's where I was when I learned that some places breathe, and what breathes can also hunger. Name's Kylian. I've been a recreational spelunker for about 7 years, mostly exploring lava tubes throughout Oregon and Washington. There's something pure about it, something that strips away all the bullshit of modern life. Down there, it's just you, the rock, and the absolute silence that makes you understand how loud the world above really is. Most of the tubes I explore are mapped, documented, safe as anything underground can be. But every so often you hear about unmapped systems, virgin passages that maybe only 1 or 2 people have ever seen. That's the real draw for guys like me. The possibility of being the first human eyes to see a formation that's been growing in darkness since before civilization existed. I heard about the tube system near Bend from a guy named Rodrigo who worked at a climbing gym I frequent. He'd stumbled on an entrance while hiking off-trail, marked it on his GPS, but never went in deep because he was alone. And that's rule 1 of caving, never go alone. He showed me photos of the entrance, a collapsed ceiling section that opened into what looked like a substantial passage. We planned to explore it together, but Rodrigo broke his ankle 2 weeks before our scheduled trip. Compound fracture, surgery, the whole deal. He'd be off his feet for months. I should have waited. Should have found another partner or just let it go. But I'd already taken the time off work, already had my gear packed. And I kept looking at those photos Rodrigo had sent. The entrance was clean, the passage looked stable, and I told myself I'd just do a preliminary survey, mark it properly, and come back with a full team later. I'd gone into dozens of tubes. I knew what I was doing. Pride and impatience, that's what really drove me into that hole in the ground. The hike to the entrance took 3 hours through dense pine forest and over terrain that had no business being called a trail. When I finally found the collapse, it was exactly as Rodrigo had described. A section where the tube's ceiling had given way maybe a decade ago, creating a skylight that opened into the passage below. I rappelled down about 40 feet and found myself in a lava tube maybe 15 feet in diameter, the walls that characteristic ropey texture of Pahoho flow. My headlamp beam disappeared into darkness in both directions. I chose to go east, arbitrary as any decision made in the dark. The passage was stable, the floor covered in breakdown rock and volcanic dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. I marked my route with reflective tape every 50 feet, standard practice, and kept one eye on my GPS tracker even though I knew it wouldn't work once I got deep enough. The silence was total. That special quality of quiet you only get underground where there's literally nothing to make sound except you. About 30 minutes in, I noticed the air current. Not unusual in lava tubes. They often connect to multiple surface openings, creating natural ventilation. But this current was strange. It wasn't constant. It pulsed. 3 seconds of air moving past my face, 3 seconds of stillness, then 3 seconds of air again, regular as a heartbeat. I stopped to feel it, holding my hand up. The rhythm never varied. In, out, pause. In, out, pause. I told myself it was atmospheric pressure equalizing, some quirk of the tube geometry creating regular pulses. Caves do weird things with air. I'd experienced strange winds before, even heard singing rocks in slot canyons where wind creates eerie harmonics. This was just another geological oddity. I marked it in my notes and kept moving. The passage began to slope downward, gentle at first, then more pronounced. My altimeter showed I'd descended another 100 feet over the course of maybe 20 minutes. The tube walls were changing too, becoming smoother, the ropey texture giving way to something that looked almost polished. I ran my hand along the surface, and it was slick. Not wet exactly, but like touching glass that's been breathed on. The air current was stronger now, the rhythm more pronounced, and I could hear it. A soft whistling sound on the exhale, a subtle rush on the inhale. That's when I smelled it. Sulfur, definitely. But also something organic, something that reminded me of the time I'd found a dead deer in the woods behind my house, 3 days into decomposition. The smell came with the exhale, that 3-second pulse of air pushing out from deeper in the system. I almost turned back then. Every instinct was saying this wasn't right, wasn't normal, that lava tubes don't smell like rot and they definitely don't breathe with metronomic precision. But I could see light ahead. Not daylight, but a faint bioluminescent glow, green-blue and pulsing in time with the air current. I'd heard of glowworms in caves, certain types of fungi that produce light, and the scientist in me wanted to document it. I pushed forward, breathing through my mouth to avoid the worst of the smell, and emerged into a chamber that made me forget everything I'd learned about volcanic geology. The space was massive, cathedral-sized, with the ceiling lost in darkness above my headlamp's reach. The walls were covered in that same smooth, slick surface, and they glowed. Not brightly, but with that same green-blue luminescence, pulsing in perfect synchronization. In, the walls brightened. Out, they dimmed. The rhythm was everywhere now, unavoidable, and I could feel it in my chest, my own breathing starting to match the cadence of whatever the hell I was standing inside. The floor of the chamber sloped down to a central depression, maybe 30 feet across, and that's where the smell was coming from. I approached the edge and aimed my headlamp down into it. The depression was deep. My light couldn't find the bottom. But I could see the walls were moving. Not collapsing or shifting, moving deliberately, contracting and expanding, flesh-like, organic. The entire chamber was breathing, and I was standing inside something's lung. I should have run. Every fiber of my being was screaming to turn around, climb back up that passage, and never speak of this place again. But I was paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing. Lava tubes don't have living walls. Rock doesn't pulse and glow and contract like muscle tissue. This wasn't geology. This was biology on a scale that shouldn't exist. The breathing changed. The rhythm that had been so steady, so regular, suddenly accelerated. The 3-second intervals compressed to 2 seconds, then 1, the chamber brightening and dimming faster, the air moving with enough force now that my jacket rippled. The smell intensified, that rot stench mixing with sulfur until I gagged and stumbled backward. From the central depression came a sound, a low vibration that I felt more than heard, resonating through the stone beneath my feet and up through my bones. I ran. No more documentation, no more scientific curiosity. Pure animal panic drove me back toward the passage entrance, my headlamp beam bouncing wildly as I scrambled over breakdown. Behind me, the chamber's breathing became violent, hurricane-force exhalations punctuated by gasping inhalations that seemed to pull at me, trying to drag me back. The smooth walls of the passage were contracting, the tube getting narrower, and I realized with absolute horror that it was closing, that whatever I'd woken up was trying to seal itself with me inside. I've never moved faster in my life. The reflective tape markers flew past in a blur, each one a small mercy that I was still on the right path. The passage walls were warm now, hot even, and getting hotter. The slick surface was secreting something, a clear fluid that made the floor treacherous. I slipped, fell hard on my shoulder, got up and kept running. The breathing was right behind me, each exhalation a blast of fetid air that pushed me forward like a hand at my back. I saw the entrance collapse ahead, that beautiful circle of gray daylight, and I've never been so grateful for the sight of sky in my life. The rope was still there, hanging like salvation. I grabbed it and climbed, hand over hand, my shoulders screaming, my lungs burning. Below me, the passage exhaled one final time, a roar of expelled air that shot up through the opening like a geyser, hot and reeking and angry. I cleared the edge and collapsed on solid ground, dragging myself away from the opening on my elbows. For several minutes, I just lay there, breathing real air, feeling sunshine on my face, relearning what it meant to be on the surface. When I finally looked back at the collapse, the opening seemed smaller somehow, the edges crumbling inward, and I swear I could still hear it, faint and distant, that rhythmic breathing from somewhere deep below. I never filed a report, never marked the location on any map. I told Rodrigo I couldn't find the entrance, that maybe his GPS coordinates were off. The gear I left down there, tape markers, a spare light, my notes, can stay forever. Some caves aren't meant to be explored. Some darkness isn't empty. And some places in the earth are alive in ways that predate and transcend everything we think we know about what's possible. I still go caving sometimes, but only in commercial caves now. Tourist spots with guides and established routes. Because I know what's out there in the unmapped places, in the deep tubes that run like arteries through the volcanic stone. I know that the earth has secrets, and some of those secrets breathe, and they don't appreciate visitors. Look, I know how this sounds. 4 people, total strangers, all having the exact same nightmare about a place none of us had ever been to? Yeah, I get it. Sounds like internet creepypasta garbage. But I was there. I lived it. And the worst part isn't that we all dreamed about the same place. It's that we all walked toward it anyway, knowing exactly what was waiting. My name's Emery, and this is about the thing that called us to mile 1847 on the Pacific Crest Trail. I started my through hike in April, Kennedy Meadows, planning to go northbound through Oregon and into Washington before the snow hit. Standard stuff for someone with more time than sense and a desperate need to figure out what the hell to do with their life after a divorce that took everything except my hiking boots. The trail's a moving community. You see the same faces day after day, camp near the same people, share meals and stories at resupply stops. But you also meet solo hikers, people doing sections, weekend warriors. It's a constant flow of humanity through wilderness, which is probably why nobody thought much about the dreams at first. Mine started in southern Oregon, just past Crater Lake. I'd gone to sleep in my tent after a brutal 23-mile day, legs aching, feet blistered. The kind of exhausted where you're unconscious before your head fully hits the stuff sack you're using as a pillow. The dream was vivid in that hyper-real way where you know you're dreaming but can't wake yourself up. I was standing in a clearing I'd never seen before, surrounded by old-growth Douglas firs so massive they blocked out most of the sky. There was a rock formation in the center, 3 boulders stacked in a way that couldn't be natural, creating an archway maybe 8 feet tall. And there was sound. Not quite music, not quite voices, but something that made my teeth ache and my stomach clench. In the dream, I knew exactly where this place was. Mile 1847. The knowledge was absolute, like knowing your own name. I woke up with the worst headache of my life, took some ibuprofen, and figured it was just my brain processing trail fatigue. Except the next night, same dream. Exact same clearing, same impossible rock formation, same sound that made my bones vibrate. And again, that certainty. Mile 1847. I was at mile 1791 according to my GPS, 56 miles away. At the next resupply stop, I met Kalani at the outfitter. She was restocking food, looked about as wrecked as I felt, and when I casually mentioned weird dreams, her face went white. We sat outside on the curb and compared notes. Her dreams had started 4 nights ago. Same clearing, same rocks, same sound. She was hiking southbound, currently at mile 1903, 56 miles away in the opposite direction. We found Corbin at the hostel that night. He'd been having the dreams for a week, started talking about it at dinner, and the relief on his face when we told him he wasn't alone was almost painful to watch. Section hiker only, doing Oregon, currently at mile 1789. Then there was Thea, who we met purely by accident at the small grocery store. She wasn't even a hiker, she was a trail angel, someone who helps hikers with rides and supplies. But she'd been having the dreams too, and she lived in a town approximately 56 miles by road from where the trail crossed mile 1847. 4 people, 4 different starting points, all having identical dreams about the same location, all positioned exactly 56 miles away. We sat in Thea's living room that night, comparing details, trying to find rational explanations. Shared exposure to something, bad water, some kind of localized fungal spores that cause hallucinations. But we'd all been in different locations when the dreams started, eating different food, drinking from different sources. The only commonality was the trail itself, and that specific destination that none of us had reached yet. Corbin suggested we just avoid mile 1847 entirely. Skip that section, get a trail angel to shuttle us past it. Problem solved. But Kalani pointed out that skipping trail miles went against everything a through hike represented. And besides, what if the dreams didn't stop? What if they got worse? Thea, who had no obligation to any of this, said she felt compelled to go there. That the dreams weren't just random synapses firing, but something calling her. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt it too. The pull. The certainty that we needed to go to that clearing, that whatever was generating these dreams wanted us there. We decided to go together. 4 people is safer than 1, and we'd reach the location from different directions on the same day, meet at the clearing, and figure out what the hell was happening. Maybe it was a shared delusion. Maybe we'd get there and find nothing and could all laugh about it later in therapy. But we'd go, we'd see, and we'd document everything. I reached the coordinates at 2 p.m. on a Thursday in late September. My GPS showed mile 1847.3, just off the main trail, maybe 100 yards. The forest was silent in that wrong way where your brain knows something's off before your conscious mind catches up. No birds, no wind, no insects, just oppressive quiet. I found the clearing exactly as it had appeared in my dreams. The massive firs, the 3-boulder archway, even the quality of light filtering through the canopy matched. Kalani arrived 10 minutes later from the north, then Corbin from the south. We waited for Thea, who'd hiked in from the nearest Forest Service road. She arrived at 2:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was checking my watch obsessively, aware that we were all standing in a place we'd only ever seen while unconscious. The rock formation was real. The clearing was real. And that sound, we could all hear it now, not in a dream, but in waking life. It came from the archway, a low-frequency hum that you felt more than heard, that made your chest cavity resonate and your vision blur, slightly at the edges. Corbin approached the archway first. He's braver than me, or maybe just more reckless. He got within 5 feet before he stopped, his whole body going rigid. He turned to look at us, and his face was wrong. Not disfigured, not obviously changed, but wrong in the way a reflection in a warped mirror is wrong. His mouth moved, but the words came out delayed, like watching a badly dubbed movie. He said, "Don't come closer. It's not what we thought. It's not..." And then he stepped through the archway. He didn't disappear. That would have been almost easier to process. Instead, he was just on the other side, standing in the same clearing, visible through the gap between the boulders. But there were 2 of him. One standing in front of the archway, one standing behind it, both moving in perfect synchronization. Then 4 of him, then 8. Multiplying with each second, each version standing in the exact same position, layered over each other like a glitched video game texture. Kalani screamed. Thea grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. And Corbin, all the versions of him, turned to face us with expressions of absolute terror. His mouth opened and that sound came out, that same humming drone from the dreams, but louder now, deafening, and it was coming from all of him at once. Dozens of voices overlapping into a chorus that shouldn't exist. I don't remember deciding to run. I just remember running, crashing through underbrush, my pack forgotten, my hiking poles dropped somewhere behind me. Kalani was beside me, then ahead of me, and Thea was screaming something I couldn't make out over the sound of my own heartbeat. We ran until the forest sounds came back, until we could hear birds again, and wind, and the normal acoustic landscape of the wilderness. We ran until my lungs were burning and my legs gave out, and I collapsed against a tree, gasping and sobbing and trying to understand what I'd just seen. Thea had her phone out, trying to call for help. But there was no signal. There's never signal that deep in the wilderness. Kalani was rocking back and forth, repeating, "He's still there, he's still there," over and over. We waited an hour, maybe two, hoping Corbin would catch up, that he'd somehow extracted himself from whatever that archway had done to him. He never came. We hiked out together, made it to a ranger station by nightfall, reported a missing hiker, gave them the coordinates, described what we'd seen in the most rational terms we could manage without sounding completely insane. They sent a search and rescue team, found the clearing, found the rock formation, found Corbin's pack and poles, never found Corbin. The official report lists him as a missing hiker, presumed dead due to exposure or fall injury, body not recovered. But I know what happened to him. We all do. He's still there, at mile 1847, standing in front of that archway. Or behind it. Or both. Existing in multiple states simultaneously, trapped in whatever that place does to reality. The dreams stopped after that day. None of us have had them since. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if Corbin dreams. If all those versions of him share the same nightmares, or if each one is separate, alone, screaming in perfect synchronization where no one can hear. I finished my through hike. Skipped that section, obviously. Got a shuttle past mile 1840 to mile 1855, and kept going north. Made it to Canada, got my trail name, checked all the boxes. But I know I didn't really complete it. There's a 15-mile gap in my journey that I'll never fill, and a clearing I'll never return to, and a friend who answered a call that should never have been made. The Pacific Crest Trail is 2,650 miles of some of the most beautiful wilderness in North America. I'd recommend it to anyone. Just maybe skip mile 1847. Trust me on that one. They say the ocean keeps secrets. I used to think that was poetic nonsense, the kind of thing people put on motivational posters next to pictures of sunsets. Then I spent 3 weeks studying tide pools on the southern Oregon coast and learned that some secrets have voices, and some of those voices know things they shouldn't. This happened to me. Every word is true. I'm a marine biologist named Malia, and I need to tell someone before I forget my own name. The research grant was a dream come true. 3 weeks of solo fieldwork documenting microbial communities in intertidal zones, specifically focusing on extremophile bacteria that thrive in the harsh conditions where ocean meets land. My university gave me a stipend, access to a small cabin right on the coast, and the freedom to work at my own pace. I'd be collecting samples during low tide cycles, which meant a lot of pre-dawn work and late evening sessions. Perfect. I've always preferred working alone, and the coast in October is cold enough that tourists stay away. Just me, the rocks, and the endless rhythm of waves. The cabin was basic but functional, perched on a bluff overlooking a stretch of coastline that saw maybe 3 visitors a year. The nearest town was 12 miles inland, close enough for supply runs, but far enough that I had complete isolation. I arrived on a Monday, spent Tuesday organizing my equipment and mapping the tide pool clusters I'd be sampling. The pools were incredible. Some no bigger than a dinner plate, others the size of small cars, all teeming with anemones, urchins, crabs, and the microscopic life I was there to study. I started hearing the voices on my 4th day. The first low tide was at 5:47 a.m., still dark, and I was working by headlamp, carefully scraping biofilm samples from rocks and transferring them to collection vials. The sound of surf was constant, a white noise backdrop I'd already learned to tune out. But underneath it, I heard something else. Whispering, faint like multiple people having quiet conversations just out of earshot. I looked around, headlamp beam cutting through the darkness, but the beach was empty. Just me and the tide pools and the receding ocean. I went back to work, convinced it was just the water moving through rock channels, acoustic tricks caused by the complex geography. But the whispering continued, and as the sky started to lighten, I could almost make out words. Not clearly, but the cadence was definitely language, definitely human. I moved closer to the largest tide pool, a kidney-shaped depression maybe 10 feet across and 3 feet deep at its center. The whispering was louder there, emanating from the water itself. I'm a scientist. My first thought wasn't supernatural. It was biological. Pistol shrimp can create sounds through cavitation bubbles. Certain fish vocalize. Maybe I was hearing some species I wasn't familiar with. Sound waves traveling through the water in unusual ways. I leaned over the pool, ear close to the surface, trying to identify the source. That's when I heard my name. Clear as glass, a voice from the water said, "Malia." I jerked back so hard I dropped my collection kit. Vials scattered across the rocks, one rolling into the tide pool with a small splash. I stood there, heart hammering, staring at the water. The surface was calm except for the small ripples from the dropped vial. Anemones waved their tentacles. A hermit crab scuttled across a rock. Everything normal, everything explicable. Except I had definitely heard my name spoken from that pool. I told myself I was exhausted, that I'd gotten up too early, that my brain was playing tricks in the pre-dawn darkness. I gathered my scattered equipment and moved to a different cluster of pools 50 yards down the beach. But even there, I heard it. Fainter, but unmistakable. Voices discussing things in tones too low to fully comprehend, and occasionally, cutting through the murmur, my name. Always my name. Never shouted, always spoken conversationally. Like the tide pools were having discussions about me. By the time the tide started coming back in, I'd convinced myself I was experiencing auditory hallucinations brought on by isolation and the repetitive sound of waves. I went back to the cabin, ate breakfast, and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whispering, and I kept jerking awake with my heart racing. I lasted maybe 2 hours before giving up and spending the day analyzing the samples I'd collected, trying to focus on work, on data, on things that made sense. The evening low tide was at 6:15 p.m. I almost didn't go, almost stayed in the cabin with music playing loud to drown out the ocean sounds. But I had a research timeline, and skipping collection sessions wasn't an option. I geared up, grabbed my headlamp, and headed down to the beach as the sun dropped below the horizon. The tide pools were exposed again, reflecting the deepening blue of twilight. And the voices started immediately. This time they were clearer. I could make out words, fragments of sentences. A voice that sounded like my mother saying, "Always knew she'd come back." Another voice, deeper, discussing the samples she took from the North Cluster. A child's voice asking, "Does she remember yet?" I stood frozen on the rocks, listening to conversations that couldn't be happening, about topics that made no sense. My mother lived in Arizona, and we'd barely spoken in years. No one knew which pools I was sampling from. Remember what? I approached the large kidney-shaped pool again. The whispering intensified as I got closer, resolving into distinct voices, maybe a dozen of them, overlapping but comprehensible. They were talking about my research, citing specific bacteria species I'd identified in my preliminary analysis. They mentioned my dissertation advisor by name. They discussed a paper I'd published 2 years ago, quoting passages I'd written. And then one voice, cold and clear as winter rain, said she doesn't know about the accident yet. My blood went ice. What accident? I pulled out my phone. No signal, never any signal out here, and started walking back toward the cabin. Behind me, the voices rose in volume, calling my name, saying, "Don't leave," and "She needs to understand," and "It's already happened." I broke into a run, slipping on wet rocks, catching myself with my hands, scraping my palms raw. The cabin seemed impossibly far, the path up the bluff steeper than I remembered. I made it inside, locked the door, and immediately tried the landline. Dead. The power was out too, which was strange because it had been fine when I'd left. I used my phone's flashlight to check the breaker box. Everything looked normal, but flipping switches did nothing. My laptop was dead despite being fully charged that morning. My backup battery pack wouldn't turn on. Every electronic device I had was inert, useless. The whispering was inside now. Not from the tide pools hundreds of yards away, but inside the cabin, coming from the bathroom. I crept toward the sound, every horror movie instinct screaming at me to run instead. But where would I go? The nearest house was miles away. The road barely passable in daylight, and it was full dark now. I pushed open the bathroom door, and the whispering was coming from the sink, from the water in the pipes, from the toilet bowl. Multiple voices, all talking at once, all saying my name. I ran outside, into the night, down to where I'd parked my car. Fumbled with my keys, dropped them, found them again. The car started, thank God the car started, and I threw it into reverse, tires spitting gravel. I didn't turn on the headlights until I was on the main road, driving way too fast on curves I could barely see. The nearest town, 12 miles of winding coastal highway, felt like 100. I pulled into the parking lot of the only gas station, hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the ignition. The fluorescent lights of the station were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I went inside, must have looked like hell because the clerk immediately asked if I was okay. I tried to explain, tried to find words that didn't sound insane, and that's when I saw the date on the register display. October 29th. I'd arrived at the cabin on October 7th. It should have been October 10th, maybe 11th. I'd lost 19 days. The clerk let me use the phone. I called my department chair, who answered with, "Jesus Christ, Malia, where have you been?" Apparently, I'd missed 2 scheduled check-ins. They'd sent someone to the cabin 3 days ago and found it empty, my equipment scattered on the beach, my car gone. They'd filed a missing person report. Search and rescue had been looking for me. And my mother had been in a car accident 2 weeks ago. She was in ICU. She'd been asking for me. I drove straight to the hospital, 15 hours of numb highway driving. My mother was unconscious, had been since the Soy-style accident. The doctor said she'd been saying my name in her sleep, over and over, along with other things that didn't make sense. I sat with her for 3 days before she woke up. Her first words were, "The tide pools told you, didn't they?" I never went back to that cabin, never retrieved my equipment or my samples. The university marked the research as incomplete and I lost the grant. My mother recovered but won't talk about what she meant, just gets a strange look in her eyes and changes the subject. I switched my research focus to freshwater systems, as far from the ocean as I can get. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, whispering from the bathroom sink, from rain puddles, from my water glass on the nightstand. Voices discussing things they shouldn't know, mentioning people I haven't thought about in years, predicting events that haven't happened yet but always do. The ocean keeps secrets, sure. But sometimes those secrets leak out through the places where water collects and waits. And once they've spoken to you, once they've called your name, they never really stop. They're just waiting for the next low tide, the next moment when you're alone near water, to remind you that they know everything, and they're always listening. I document the impossible for a living, not ghosts or UFOs or any of that tabloid garbage. I'm a professional photographer specializing in environmental change, specifically old-growth forest ecosystems in the Pacific Northwest. My work requires precision, repeated visits to the same locations, careful documentation of changes that occur over months or years. I use fixed camera positions, GPS coordinates accurate to within 3 feet, and I keep meticulous records. Which is why I know with absolute certainty that what happened in the North Cascades last month violates every law of biology, physics, and basic reality. My name is Tegan, and I have photographic evidence of trees that shouldn't exist. The project started in June. I was commissioned by a conservation group to document a specific section of old-growth forest slated for potential preservation. The area was remote, accessible only by a rough Forest Service road and then a 2-mile hike. Classic Cascade landscape: Douglas fir, western hemlock, western red cedar, some specimens easily 400 years old. My job was simple: establish photo points, document the forest in summer, return in fall to capture seasonal changes, compile the images into a presentation that would help secure protected status for the area. I made my first visit on June 15th. Spent 2 days establishing 12 photo points, each one marked with a discrete metal stake driven into the ground and GPS tagged. I took reference photos from each position, carefully noting landmarks, specific trees, understory vegetation. Professional, thorough, exactly what I've done on dozens of similar projects. The forest was healthy, spectacular even. Some of those firs had trunks 8 feet in diameter, crowns disappearing into the canopy 150 feet up. I took hundreds of photos, made detailed notes, and felt good about the project. Second visit was in early August. The hike-in felt longer than I remembered, but summer heat can do that. I found my first photo point by GPS, set up my tripod in the exact position using the metal stake as reference, and immediately knew something was wrong. The view didn't match. There was a massive cedar directly in my sight line that hadn't been there in June. I'm not talking about a sapling I'd overlooked. This was a mature tree, at least 3 feet in diameter, covered in the kind of deeply furrowed bark that takes centuries to develop. I checked my June photos. No cedar. The sightline had been clear, showing a cluster of hemlocks about 50 yards out. Those hemlocks were still there, but now the cedar stood between my position and them. I checked my GPS 3 times. Correct coordinates. I checked the metal stake. Still there, exactly where I'd placed it. But the forest had changed in a way that wasn't possible. I documented it. That's what I do. When something doesn't make sense, you photograph it and sort it out later. I moved to photo point 2. Same problem. A Douglas fir that hadn't existed in June now dominated the frame, easily 6 feet in diameter, with the drooping branch structure and fire-scarred bark of an ancient specimen. Points 3, 4, and 5 showed similar impossibilities. New trees, all of them massive and mature, standing in positions that had been empty forest floor 2 months earlier. At point 6, I found my first piece of evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. There was a tree, a huge western red cedar, growing directly through a fallen log I'd specifically noted in my June documentation. The log was still there, still decomposing, covered in the same shelf fungi. but the cedar trunk passed through it, like the log was incorporeal, bark and wood occupying the same space. I touched both. They were solid, real, physically impossible. I spent the rest of that day obsessively checking and rechecking. I pulled out my printed reference photos and held them up, comparing them to the current view. The differences were undeniable. Trees that hadn't existed were now present, and not saplings that had grown quickly. These were ancient giants that would have taken 300 or 400 years to reach their current size. I photographed everything from every angle, took measurements, collected bark samples. By the time I hiked out, I had 800 new photos and a growing certainty that something fundamentally wrong was happening in that forest. I spent 3 weeks analyzing the data, comparing images, running them through photogrammetry software to detect tampering. Nothing. The photos were genuine. The GPS data was accurate. The physical evidence, bark samples, measurements, all indicated trees of significant age. I reached out to my contact at the conservation group, carefully explaining what I'd found without sounding completely insane. They were skeptical, but interested enough to fund another visit. Third visit was September 23rd. I brought a colleague this time, another photographer named Denver, who I trusted to be objective. We hiked in together, and I explained the situation as neutrally as possible. When we reached photo point 1, his reaction matched mine. The cedar was still there, but now there were 2 more massive firs that hadn't been present in August. The tree line, the clear demarcation between old growth and the younger forest, had moved, shifted lower down the slope by at least 50 yards, and the new section was filled with centuries-old trees. Denver took his own photos while I worked through my established points. Every single location showed new growth, and by new, I mean ancient. At point 9, we found a hemlock that was growing from a rocky outcrop that I knew for a fact had been barren in June. The tree's roots wrapped around the stone in patterns that would have taken decades to form. Denver measured the tree's circumference, calculated its likely age based on ring counts from similar specimens, and came up with an estimate of 250 years, minimum. We camped that night near the forest edge, too unsettled to hike out in the dark. I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m. I heard it, a sound like wood creaking, but sustained, rhythmic. I left the tent and stood in the darkness, listening. The sound came from multiple directions, deep groans and pops like old houses settling. But this was the forest making those sounds. Denver heard it too. We stood together in the cold, headlamps off, listening to the forest grow. At first light, we checked photo point 12, which we hadn't reached the previous day. The change was dramatic. 3 enormous cedars now formed a triangle where my June photos showed open forest floor. But what made Denver grab my arm and swear was the smell. Fresh sap. The kind of smell you get from newly cut wood, resinous and sharp. These trees that appeared to be centuries old were seeping sap like they'd just been wounded or just grown. We found more evidence as the morning progressed. Fallen branches from the new trees that showed fresh breaks. Bark that felt slightly tacky to the touch, not quite set. And most disturbing, on one of the massive firs, rings in the exposed wood of a broken branch. Denver counted them, 47 rings. That tree, which every other measurement suggested was 300 years old, had 47 rings. It had grown to ancient proportions in less than half a century, or the rings were lying, or something else entirely was happening that we didn't have words for. By noon, we both wanted out. Not scared exactly, but deeply unsettled by the wrongness of it all. We packed up and started hiking toward the trailhead. But the forest had other ideas. The trail we'd come in on was gone. Not overgrown, not obscured. Gone. In its place were trees, the same massive old-growth specimens, standing where the path should have been. We consulted the GPS, which insisted we were on the trail. But our eyes and the physical reality of dozens of enormous trees said otherwise. Denver suggested we just bushwhack straight toward the road using compass bearing, and we tried. But every direction we moved seemed to lead us into denser forest, older trees, increasingly impassable terrain. After 2 hours, we stopped for water, and I realized we'd somehow circled back to photo point 3. I knew because my metal stake was still there, and the specific cluster of trees I'd photographed multiple times was unmistakable. That's when I saw it. On one of the massive firs that hadn't existed in June, there was a carving, old, weathered, barely visible in the deeply furrowed bark. Initials and a date. TH, 1987. My initials. 38 years ago, when I was 7 years old and had never been to the Cascades. The carving was real, aged, the bark grown around it in ways that take decades to develop. Denver saw his own initials on another tree, dated 1992. He would have been 11? Neither of us had carved anything. Neither of us had been to this specific location before this year. But the trees insisted otherwise. Showed us evidence of visits that never happened, carried marks from a history that didn't exist until the trees created it retroactively. We stopped trying to leave and started trying to understand. The forest was moving through time differently than we were. Or it was creating its own history, or it was reaching back and forward simultaneously, becoming what it would have been if humans had never logged these mountains. Every tree that appeared was a ghost of what should have existed. The forest correcting itself, filling in the gaps our species had created. I don't know how we got out. One moment we were standing in the ancient grove, watching more trees shimmer into existence like heat mirages solidifying. And the next, we were on the Forest Service road with no memory of the walkout. Our gear was there, our photos intact. But 3 days had passed according to our watches and phones. 3 days compressed into what felt like minutes. I submitted my report to the conservation group. Included all the photos, all the documentation, the impossible evidence of a forest that was growing backward and forward through time. They thanked me politely and hired a different photographer to redo the project. That photographer's images showed a normal forest, no anomalies, no new old growth, just regular trees in regular positions. But I have my photos. I have Denver's testimony. And I have this, satellite imagery of the area from June and October. The tree cover increased by 17%. Not saplings, not young growth. The canopy density analysis shows mature old growth where none existed before. The forest is reclaiming itself, editing reality to show what would have been there if we'd never cut it down. And it's spreading. Last I checked, the anomaly zone had expanded by 40 acres. Give it time, and the entire North Cascades might revert to primordial forest, centuries of logging undone by whatever force is rewriting the rules. I don't photograph forests anymore. Can't trust what the camera shows me, can't trust that the trees will stay where I put them. But sometimes I look at those images from September, at my initials carved in bark by a version of me that never existed until the tree needed her to. And I wonder if I'm still there, in some version of that forest, watching new ancient trees grow from nothing, trying to document the impossible while reality rewrites itself one ring at a time. Technology doesn't lie. That's what I kept telling myself. Machines record objective reality, Frequencies, wavelengths, data points that exist independent of human perception. My equipment captured screams in a silent forest. And I need you to understand that I'm not crazy. I'm not fabricating this, and I wish to God I'd never heard what those recordings contained. This is Silas. I'm a sound engineer, and I documented something that wants to be heard. I've spent 15 years recording natural soundscapes for various media projects. Nature documentaries, meditation apps, sound libraries for film production. It's specialized work that requires patience, high-end equipment, and a tolerance for isolation. You can't capture pristine forest ambiance with road noise bleeding through, so you go deep, really deep, into places where human sound hasn't penetrated in decades, or maybe ever. The Hoh rainforest in Olympic National Park is perfect for this. Temperate rainforest, incredibly biodiverse, and certain sections are remote enough that you can record for hours without a single airplane, car, or human voice contaminating the audio. I got the commission in early October from a meditation app company looking for premium Pacific Northwest forest ambiance. They wanted 20 minutes of clean recording, birdsong, wind through trees, water sounds, that sort of thing. Simple job, good pay. And I needed an excuse to get out of the studio anyway. I loaded my gear into my truck, a Sound Devices Mix pre-recorder, 2 Sennheiser shotgun mics, a Rode stereo pair, portable power supplies, and monitoring headphones that cost more than most people's cars. Professional grade everything, because in my line of work, equipment quality is the difference between usable audio and expensive garbage. The hike into my chosen location took 3 hours. I'd scouted the area on a previous trip and marked a spot about 6 miles in where the forest was particularly lush and the ambient sound was perfect. No trail noise, no distant highway drone, just pure wilderness audio. I set up my recording rig in a small clearing, positioned the mics to capture a wide stereo field, ran levels, and started recording. Then I did what you always do when recording natural ambiance. I sat down, stayed quiet, and let the forest forget I was there. The first hour was exactly what I expected. The recorder's meters showed consistent levels. The rustling of the massive mossy trees in the breeze, occasional bird calls, the distant sound of water moving over rocks. I monitored through headphones for the first 20 minutes, making sure there were no issues, then switched to just watching the meters to avoid fatigue. Recording ambiance is boring, which is precisely the point. You want boring. Boring means consistent, usable audio. Around the 90-minute mark, the meters spiked. A sharp transient peak that hit the red, the kind of level that indicates extremely loud sound. I grabbed my headphones and put them on, expecting to hear a tree branch cracking or maybe an elk bugling nearby. Instead, I heard silence. Complete, absolute silence. The forest had gone dead quiet in that way that makes your lizard brain scream danger. No birds, no wind, nothing. The meters showed signal, peaking into the red at irregular intervals, but my ears registered only silence. I stopped the recording and played back the last minute. Through the headphones, I could hear it. A sound that my ears in real time couldn't perceive, but the microphones had captured. Screaming. Humans screaming, multiple voices, agonized and terrified, coming from every direction at once. The waveform on the recorder's display showed the peaks clearly, measured them objectively. The sound was there, real, recorded at approximately 18 to 22 kHz, right at the upper edge of human hearing range. Too high for my 43-year-old ears to detect naturally, but well within the capture range of professional microphones. I sat there staring at the recorder's display, watching the waveform scroll past, showing sustained high-frequency content that should not exist in a forest setting. The screaming, because that's what it was, I could slow it down and pitch it lower to hear it clearly. Continued for 3 minutes, then stopped. The forest sounds resumed normally. Birds, wind, the baseline ambient noise I'd been recording. My hands were shaking as I rewound and played the section again, this time with the pitch shifted down to bring the frequency into normal hearing range. The screams were articulate. Not animal sounds, not wind, not any natural phenomenon I could identify. Human voices, dozens of them maybe, all screaming words I couldn't quite make out, but that had the clear phonetic structure of language. And underneath the screaming, a low-frequency drone, subsonic, something I could feel more than hear even through the headphones. The kind of frequency that makes your chest cavity resonate, that triggers primal fear responses. I should have packed up, should have taken my equipment and hiked out immediately. But I'm a professional, and more than that, I'm curious in the way that's gotten humans killed since we first started investigating sounds in dark caves. I reset the recorder, checked all my connections, and started a new recording session. If this was some bizarre natural phenomenon, I wanted to document it properly. If my equipment was malfunctioning, I needed to know. I sat there in the silent forest, watching the meters, waiting. 37 minutes later, it happened again. The meters peaked. The forest went silent to my ears, and the microphones captured screaming. This time I recorded for 15 minutes, documenting the entire event. The screaming would swell and fade, sometimes sounding distant, sometimes so close that the meters showed clipping distortion. I adjusted levels on the fly, trying to capture clean audio, operating on autopilot while my conscious mind tried to process what I was documenting. Then I heard my name, not through the forest, not in real time, but through the headphones, in the playback. Crystal clear, a voice among the screaming saying Silas, with perfect clarity. I tore off the headphones and stood up, heart hammering. The forest was still silent, that wrong silence where even the insects have gone quiet. I looked around the clearing, seeing nothing but moss-covered trees and the dense undergrowth. No people, no source for the voices. Nothing but me and my equipment. I forced myself to sit back down and continue monitoring. The voice came again, and this time I recognized it. My brother Finnegan, who died 6 years ago in a climbing accident in the Cascades. His voice, unmistakable, calling my name among the chorus of screams. Then other voices I recognized. My mother, dead for a decade. A friend from college who'd killed himself. A girlfriend who died in a car crash. All of them calling out, not to me, but about me, discussing me in fragments of conversation I could almost understand. The sound engineer in me kept recording, kept adjusting levels, kept documenting. The human part of me wanted to run, but I was paralyzed by the technical impossibility of what was happening. These voices existed in frequencies I couldn't hear naturally. They were being captured by microphones as electromagnetic phenomena, translated into electrical signals, converted to digital data. This wasn't hallucination or imagination. This was measurable, quantifiable, recorded audio. When the screaming finally stopped and the forest sounds resumed, I'd been recording for 2 hours. I had nearly 4 hours of total documentation, multiple instances of the phenomenon, all captured in pristine digital quality. I packed my equipment with methodical precision, forcing my hands to stop shaking, and started hiking out. The forest felt hostile now, oppressive, like I'd recorded something I wasn't meant to hear and the wilderness knew it. I made it back to my truck as the sun was setting, loaded everything, and drove straight home. Didn't stop, didn't eat, just drove in silence because the thought of turning on the radio or playing music felt obscene after what I'd heard. When I got home, I transferred all the audio to my main workstation and spent the entire night analyzing it. The screaming was consistent across both microphone systems, ruling out equipment malfunction. The frequency content was genuine, not artifacts or interference. I could isolate individual voices, run them through spectral analysis, identify phonetic patterns. And the voices I recognized, Finnegan, my mother, the others, their vocal signatures matched recordings I had from when they were alive. Not perfectly, but close enough that voice recognition software flagged them as probable matches. I never delivered that commission. I told the meditation app company the recordings were unusable due to technical issues and returned their advance. I wouldn't, give them audio files that contained humans screaming at frequencies just beyond normal perception. Couldn't risk someone pitch-shifting them out of curiosity and hearing what I heard. But I kept the recordings. They're on an external drive in my safe, encrypted and backed up, because they're evidence of something that shouldn't exist. I've played them for exactly 3 people, 2 audio engineer colleagues and an acoustic scientist. All of them confirmed what I found. The screams are real, recorded at high frequencies, and they contain recognizable speech patterns and, in my case, recognizable voices. The acoustic scientist suggested a theory involving infrasound and ultrasound being produced by geological processes, somehow modulated in ways that create the illusion of human voices. It's a reach, but it's something. The alternative, that certain places record trauma, that the forest somehow captures and replays the death sounds of everyone who's died in these mountains, is too much to accept. But I've been back to other locations in the Cascades, other deep wilderness areas, and I've recorded again. Listening in those high frequencies where most people don't think to look. It's everywhere. Not as intense as the Ho, but present. A constant background of high-frequency human sounds, screaming and crying and calling out names, all existing just above the range where our ears can detect them, but well within the range where machines can capture them. The forest is full of voices, and they're all saying things we're not supposed to hear. I don't do remote location work anymore. I stay in studios, work with synthesizers and processed sounds, things I can control and understand. Because I've learned that silence isn't real, that what we perceive as peaceful wilderness ambiance is layered with sounds we've evolved not to hear. And sometimes not hearing is a mercy. The forest screams constantly. We just don't have the ears for it. But the machines do. The machines hear everything, and once you've listened to what they capture, you'll never trust silence again. Mountains are supposed to have tops. That's basic geography, basic reality. You climb up, you reach the summit, you plant your flag or take your photo or whatever, and then you descend. The peak is the end point, the goal. The place where up stops and only down remains. Except I reached the summit of Mount Thielsen 5 times in one day, and each time I kept climbing higher. I'm Callan, I'm an experienced mountaineer, and I need to tell you about the mountain that has no top. Mount Thielsen isn't Everest. It's not even that challenging by Cascade standards. A 9,184-foot volcanic plug in southern Oregon, nicknamed the lightning rod of the Cascades because of its sharp, exposed summit that attracts electrical storms. It's a popular climb in summer, a moderate scramble that takes most people 6 to 8 hours round trip. I'd climbed it twice before without incident. This was supposed to be a quick solo summit on a perfect October day. An easy check-in with a mountain I knew well. Instead, it became something I still can't adequately explain, even with all the evidence in my pack. The approach was standard, I started at the trailhead at 6 a.m., made good time through the forest section, reached the tree line around 8, and began the final scramble up the volcanic rock around 9:30. The weather was flawless. Clear sky, minimal wind, that crisp autumn cold that makes your lungs feel clean. I could see for 100 miles in every direction. Diamond Lake spread out below, like a blue mirror. The Three Sisters were visible to the north, Mount Shasta to the south. Perfect conditions, perfect visibility, nothing to indicate the day would become a waking nightmare. I reached the summit at 11:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my watch specifically to log it, took my summit photo with the peak marker visible, and started my usual routine: water, energy bar, a few minutes to appreciate the view before descending. The summit of Thielsen is small, maybe 10 feet across, a narrow pinnacle of fractured volcanic rock with barely enough room to stand comfortably. The peak marker is a metal rod driven into the rock with a small plaque. I've touched it twice before. I touched it again, ate my snack, and took one more look around before starting down. Except when I turned to descend. The route down wasn't there. The scramble section I'd just climbed, the obvious path through the broken rock that I'd ascended 30 minutes earlier, was gone. In its place was more mountain. The volcanic plug continued upward, another 100 feet of climbing visible above where the summit should have been. I stood there, genuinely confused, looking up at rock that hadn't existed moments before. My altimeter showed 9,184 feet. My GPS showed the correct coordinates for Thielsen summit. But my eyes showed more mountain above me, clearly visible, undeniably real. I checked my summit photo, the one I'd taken 15 minutes earlier. The image showed me at the peak marker with clear sky above. The photo timestamp matched my watch. But when I looked up from my phone, the rock continued upward, and the peak marker I'd just photographed was now 30 feet below where I stood. I hadn't moved. I'd been standing in the same spot checking my phone. But somehow the summit had risen, or I'd climbed higher without realizing it, or the mountain had grown. I made a decision that probably seems stupid in retrospect, but felt logical in the moment. I kept climbing. If there was more mountain, I'd climb it until I found the actual summit. Maybe I'd gotten disoriented. Maybe I'd reached a false peak and my GPS was glitching. Mountains don't spontaneously grow, so there had to be a rational explanation. I continued up the volcanic rock, scrambling over broken basalt, and reached another summit 20 minutes later. Same metal rod, same plaque, same narrow pinnacle. My altimeter showed 9,184 feet. My GPS showed correct coordinates. I took another summit photo. Then I turned around and saw more mountain above me. Another 100 feet of climbing, maybe more, the rock formation continuing upward in defiance of what should have been sky. I checked my photos. 2 summit photos now, both showing me at the peak marker, both time-stamped, both clearly depicting the top of the mountain. But I was standing at a summit with more summit above me. And my brain was starting to fracture, trying to reconcile the impossible. I found the first piece of physical evidence at what I'll call Summit 3. Lying on the rock near the peak marker was an energy bar wrapper. The same brand I'd eaten at Summit 1, the same flavor. I checked my pack. My wrapper was still there, tucked in the side pocket where I always put trash. But here was an identical wrapper, wind-worn and slightly faded like it had been here for days. My name was on it. I write my name on my food packaging, a habit from years of group expeditions. This was my wrapper, from a bar I'd eaten an hour ago, aged by exposure it shouldn't have had. Summit 4, which I reached around 2 p.m. according to my watch, had more evidence. Multiple energy bar wrappers, all with my name, all in various states of decay. A broken piece of my trekking pole, the pole that was still intact in my hand. And a boot print in a patch of volcanic ash that matched my boots exactly, but weathered, partially filled with debris like it had been there for weeks or months. I took photos of everything, collected some of the wrappers, and kept climbing because descending wasn't an option I could find. Every time I turned around, the route down was gone, replaced by the mountain continuing below me farther than it should, down into valleys I hadn't climbed through. At Summit 5, I found my pack. Not a similar pack, my exact pack. Same brand, same modifications, same repairs I'd made to the shoulder strap. It was lying next to the peak marker, empty, fabric degraded by weather. Inside the main compartment was my ID, my credit cards, my car keys. I checked my own pack. Everything was still there. I was wearing my pack, holding my keys, but here they were again, duplicated, aged, abandoned. That's when I understood. The mountain wasn't growing. I wasn't climbing higher. I was climbing through repetitions of the same summit, each one representing a version of me that had kept climbing, that had reached this same point and continued upward. The evidence was layered proof. The more I climbed, the more versions of myself I found, spread across impossible iterations of the same peak. And if I kept going, I'd find more. Maybe dozens more. Maybe infinite copies of this summit, each one containing remnants of the Callan, who'd climbed through it and kept going up into whatever came next. My altimeter had never changed from 9,184 feet. My GPS coordinates remained constant. According to my instruments, I'd never left the summit. I'd been standing at 9,184 feet for over 4 hours, but I'd climbed at least 500 vertical feet through 5 distinct summits, each one identical, each one proving I'd been there before despite this being my first time experiencing it. I sat down at Summit 5, surrounded by versions of my own gear in various states of decay, and tried to think. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, and I did not want to be on this mountain after dark. Not when every summit led to another summit, when every descent route vanished, when the mountain had apparently trapped me in a loop of my own climbing. I pulled out everything from my pack, took inventory. My gear was all present, all functional. I had enough water for another hour, enough food for a day if I rationed. My phone was nearly dead, but I'd taken dozens of photos documenting the impossibility. Then I had an idea born of desperation. Instead of climbing up or trying to descend, I climbed sideways, traversed across the face of the summit pinnacle at the same elevation, moving laterally instead of vertically. The rock was exposed, dangerous, not meant to be climbed this way. But I inched along, testing each handhold, moving perpendicular to the direction the mountain wanted me to go. After 20 feet of traverse, the world lurched. That's the only way I can describe it. Reality shifted like a scratched record skipping to a new groove. Suddenly, I was on a different face of the mountain, the normal face, the one I'd climbed up originally. Below me was the clear scramble route down, obvious and real. My altimeter still read 9,984 feet. My GPS still showed correct coordinates. But now when I looked up, there was only sky. I descended faster than I've ever descended anything, practically running down the scramble section, not caring about safety, just needing to be off that mountain. I reached the trailhead at 7 p.m., exhausted and shaking. My truck was exactly where I'd left it, alone in the parking lot. According to my watch and my phone, I'd been on the mountain for 13 hours. The photos in my camera roll told the story. 5 summit photos, multiple images of my own weathered gear, proof of impossible repetition. I showed the photos to exactly 2 people, a climbing partner who's known me for 15 years and a geologist who specializes in volcanic formations. Both confirmed the images were genuine and unexplainable. The gear I'd collected, the weathered wrappers with my name, the broken pole piece, I still have. They exist. Physical proof of summits I reached before I reached them. I haven't been back to Thielsen. I've climbed other mountains. But I find myself obsessively checking that there's only one summit, that the peak I reach is the last one, that up eventually stops. Because I know now that some mountains don't follow rules, that certain peaks exist in more states than our reality usually allows, and if you're unlucky enough to climb one on the wrong day, you might find yourself ascending through infinite versions of the same summit, leaving pieces of yourself at each one, climbing forever toward a top that never comes. Dreams aren't supposed to follow schedules. They're random firings of neurons, subconscious processing, the brain sorting through the day's garbage while the body rests. They definitely aren't supposed to be shared across hundreds of miles by people who've never met, converging on a single date and location with countdown precision. But that's exactly what happened to 5 of us on the Pacific Crest Trail. And the fact that we all walked toward it anyway tells you something dark about human nature. I'm Aurelia, and this is about the place that dreamed us into existence before we ever dreamed of it. The PCT is a ribbon of trail stretching from Mexico to Canada, 2,650 miles of mountains, deserts, and forests that takes 5 months to complete if you're fast and have the weather on your side. I started my through hike in late April from the southern terminus, one of maybe 3,000 people attempting the full trail that year. You develop relationships out there. Trail families form naturally. People hiking at similar paces tend to cluster together. You see the same faces at water sources and campsites. But the dreams created connections between people who should never have met, who were separated by hundreds of trail miles and weeks of hiking time. My first dream came in early June. Somewhere in the Sierra Nevada, I'd camped near Forester Pass, exhausted from the elevation and the endless snow fields. The dream was sharp, hyper-real, the kind where you're aware you're dreaming but can't control anything. I was standing on a trail I didn't recognize, surrounded by old-growth forest, thick moss covering everything. There was a specific tree ahead, a Douglas fir with a massive burl on its trunk, shaped vaguely like a human face. And there was sound. Not music, not quite voices, but something that made my teeth ache and my stomach turn. In the dream, I knew exactly where this was. Mile marker 1047. Somewhere in southern Washington, I wouldn't reach for another 2 months. The knowledge was absolute, branded into my consciousness. I woke up with a migraine that lasted 3 days. I wrote it off as altitude sickness, dehydration, the general physical trauma of hiking 25 miles a day with 40 pounds on your back. But the dream came back. Every night, the exact same dream. Same tree, same sound, same certainty about the location. And each time, I noticed something new. A specific rock formation, the angle of light through the canopy, details that felt more like memories than imagination. I first met Odin at Kennedy Meadows, the traditional start of the Sierra section. He was a southbound hiker, SOBO in trail terminology, meaning he'd started at the Canadian border and was heading toward Mexico. Our paths crossed for maybe 10 minutes at the general store while we both resupplied. I wouldn't have remembered him, except he asked, completely out of nowhere, if I'd been having weird dreams. The way he asked, nervous, embarrassed, like he was testing whether I'd call him crazy, made me stop and actually look at him. We compared notes standing in the parking lot, ignoring the other hikers around us. He'd been having the same dream for 2 weeks. Same location, same tree with the burl, same sound. He was currently at mile 1905, hiking south. I was at mile 755, hiking north. We were both approximately 1,090 trail miles from mile 1847, just approaching from opposite directions. The coincidence was disturbing enough that we exchanged contact information, promising to check in when we had cell service. I met Kendrick at Crater Lake 3 weeks later. He was a section hiker just doing Oregon, and he approached me at the Rim Village with a photo on his phone. "Have you seen this tree?" he asked, showing me a sketch he'd drawn from memory. It was the burl tree, exact details, same perspective I'd seen in my dreams. We talked for 2 hours, comparing experiences. His dreams had started a month ago. He was camped near Santiam Pass, approximately 56 trail miles from the location. He had no intention of hiking that section. His permit ended before he'd reach it. But the dreams were getting more intense, more insistent. The online PCT forums connected me with the others. There was a thread, started by someone with the username Trail Dreamer, asking if anyone else was experiencing recurring nightmares about a specific mile marker. 19 people responded initially, but most were vague or describing different dreams. 5 of us had the exact same dream, down to specific details we confirmed through private messages and video calls. Me, Odin, Kendrick, Navy, a northbound hiker about a week ahead of me, and Esme, who wasn't even on trail yet, but had been planning her through hike for next year and had started dreaming about the location 3 months ago. The disturbing part wasn't just the shared dream. It was the distance pattern. Each of us, when the dream started, was exactly 56 miles from mile marker 1008-47. 56 miles is oddly specific, not a round number, not particularly significant. But all of us, approaching from different directions at different times, started dreaming when we hit that exact radius. Esme was the outlier. She lived in Portland, and her apartment was 56 road miles from where the PCT crossed mile 1847. The dreams had driven her to measure it. We made a pact, the 5 of us, to reach the location on the same day. It took coordination. I had to speed up my hiking pace, Odin had to slow down, Kendrick had to extend his permit, and Esme had to drive out. But we all felt compelled, pulled toward that spot with an urgency that overrode common sense. Navy was already close and agreed to wait. We picked September 23rd, a date that appeared in our dreams, though none of us could explain how we knew it was significant. The dreams changed as we got closer. They became longer, more detailed, more insistent. I started seeing other hikers in the dream, shadowy figures I couldn't quite make out. The sound grew louder, evolved into something that felt like words, like being spoken to in a language I almost understood. I'd wake up with nosebleeds, with my hands cramped like I'd been gripping something. Other hikers started commenting that I looked sick, haunted, and I probably did. I'd lost 15 pounds beyond the normal trail weight loss, stopped sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours a night. By mid-September, I was hiking 30-mile days, pushing my body past reasonable limits, driven by a need I couldn't articulate. The dreams now included a countdown. I'd see the tree, hear the sound, and know exactly how many days remained until September 23rd. It appeared as a number carved into bark, written in morning dew, spelled out in fallen needles. The countdown was everywhere in the dreamscape. I reached mile marker 18847 on September 22nd, a day early, and made camp a quarter mile south. Navy was already there, looking as wrecked as I felt. We didn't talk much that first evening, just acknowledged each other with nods and set up our tents in silence. The forest felt wrong, oppressive in a way that had nothing to do with weather or terrain. The normal sounds, birds, insects, wind, were muted, distant, like we were inside a bubble of dead air. Odin arrived at dawn on the 23rd. Kendrick showed up around noon, and Esme parked at the nearest Forest Service road and hiked in, reaching us around 2 p.m. We stood together at mile marker 1847, 5 strangers connected by shared nightmares, and tried to figure out what to do next. The tree was real. The massive Douglas fir with the burl shaped like a face, exactly as we'd all seen it. The clearing was real. Everything matched our dreams with precision that eliminated any possibility of coincidence. The sound started at 3:47 p.m. We all heard it simultaneously, that same droning hum from the dreams, but louder, more physical, vibrating through our bones. It came from everywhere and nowhere, emanating from the forest itself. Navy started crying, Esme grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise, and Kendrick actually stepped backward like he was going to run. But Odin walked forward, toward the tree, and the rest of us followed, because what else could we do? We'd come all this way, walked hundreds of miles, arranged our entire lives around reaching this moment. The tree burl was moving, not growing, not shifting in wind, moving like a mouth, like the face carved into the wood was trying to speak. The sound intensified, resolved into syllables, into words we didn't recognize but somehow understood. It was speaking our names, all 5 of them, calling us forward, thanking us for coming. And then it showed us why. The tree opened. The burls split down the middle, revealing darkness inside. And in that darkness were more of us. Versions of the 5 of us, dozens of copies standing in rows, all facing outward. They were us, but wrong. Their expressions empty, their movements synchronized, and they were all slowly walking forward, emerging from inside the tree into our reality. The first version of me that stepped out looked at me with my own eyes and said, "Your turn inside." I don't remember running. None of us do. We came back to awareness scattered along the trail, separated by miles, all of us running blindly until our bodies gave out. I ended up 7 miles south, collapsed on the trail, found by another hiker who thought I'd been attacked by a bear based on how I looked. The others had similar experiences: blind panic, dissociative fugue, the primal need to get away. We never went back. The 4 of us who were on trail either skipped that section or quit entirely. Esme never started her through hike. We stay in contact, check in every few weeks, and none of us have had the dream since that day. But we all have the same waking nightmare now, wondering about those versions of ourselves we saw, wondering if they're still emerging from that tree. If they're walking among people who don't know their copies? If somewhere there's another me living my life while I try to forget that some places don't just call to you. They make you, dream you into existence, and need you to complete something we were never supposed to understand. Rescue work teaches you that people lie. Panic makes them irrational. And the wilderness doesn't care about your training or your equipment. But it doesn't prepare you for finding someone who insists they were never lost, who has no memory of calling for help, and who looks at you like you're the one who shouldn't be there. I'm Julieta. I've been with Gifford Pinchot's Search and Rescue for 8 years. And what happened last November broke something fundamental in how I understand my job. This is about the rescue that shouldn't have happened and the price of bringing someone back who never left. The call came in at 4:37 p.m. on a Wednesday, already getting dark, temperature dropping into the 20s. A distress signal from a personal locator beacon, GPS coordinates putting the hiker approximately 9 miles into the backcountry near Tucklock Lake. Standard protocol. We mobilized a 4-person team, myself as lead, with Moshe, Brantley, and Ronan handling support, navigation, and medical respectively. The coordinates were in a section of forest we knew well. Moderate terrain, nothing particularly dangerous if you stayed on trail. The concerning part was the timing. No one should have been that far in with darkness coming and a storm front predicted overnight. We reached the trailhead by 5:15 p.m. and moved fast. Headlamps cutting through the early evening gloom, following the coordinates with military precision. Search and rescue is about speed and efficiency when someone's in trouble. Every minute counts when you're dealing with exposure, injury, or panic. We covered the 9 miles in just under 2 hours, good time considering the terrain and failing light, and reached the coordinates at 7:03 p.m. We found her sitting on a fallen log, no visible distress, no obvious injury, looking annoyed more than anything. Mid-30s, decent gear, adequate clothing for the conditions. Her name was Heidi, according to the ID we checked, after she refused to provide it. The first thing she said when we approached, announced ourselves as search and rescue, and asked if she was okay was, "Why are you here? I didn't call anyone." I showed her the alert we'd received, the GPS coordinates from her personal locator beacon. She stared at me like I was speaking another language. "I don't have a PLB," she said. "Never carried one, and I'm not lost. I know exactly where I am." She pointed down what should have been a trail continuation. "The trail's right there. I'm 2 miles from the Taklak Lake trailhead, heading back to my car. I'll be there in 40 minutes. Except that wasn't right. We were 9 miles from the nearest trailhead. The direction she was pointing led deeper into wilderness, and there was no trail visible where she indicated. Moshe pulled up maps on his GPS, showed her our location. She looked at the screen, looked at us, and her expression shifted from annoyance to something approaching fear. "That's not right. Your GPS is wrong. I've been on trail the entire time." Brantley walked a perimeter check while Ronan assessed her for head injury or disorientation. No signs of trauma, pupils reactive, answers coherent, except for the fundamental disagreement about where she was and how she got there. Her gear was in good condition, her water supply adequate, her phone dead, but that wasn't unusual in the backcountry. By all observable measures, she was fine. But the distress signal was real. Her coordinates were accurate, and she had no trail to follow in the direction she insisted would lead to safety. We explained the situation as clearly as possible. It was getting colder, a storm was coming, she was miles from any trailhead, and we needed to get moving. She resisted, kept insisting we were wrong, that her car was close, that she didn't need rescue. This isn't unusual in disoriented subjects. The brain tries to maintain its version of reality even when presented with contradicting evidence. But something about her certainty was different. More absolute, like we were the ones experiencing cognitive distortion. We convinced her to come with us by agreeing to walk in the direction she indicated for 10 minutes. If we found a trail or her car, great. If not, she'd trust our navigation and come back to the trailhead with us. She agreed, and we followed her into the forest, off the established trail, into terrain that got progressively rougher. She walked with confidence, following what she clearly perceived as a path, stepping over obstacles that weren't there, making turns around trees as if navigating familiar trail features. After 10 minutes, Moshe called it. "There's no trail. We're an old-growth forest, no markers, no signs of human traffic. We need to turn back." Heidi turned to argue and stopped mid-sentence, staring past us into the darkness. Her face went white. "Where's the trail?" she asked, her voice small now, uncertain. "Where's the trail I was just on?" We brought her back to the GPS coordinates where we'd found her. And that's when things deteriorated. She started insisting she'd never been there before, that we'd walked her in circles, that we were confusing her on purpose. Ronan tried to keep her calm while I radioed base to confirm our extraction plan. The storm was moving in faster than predicted. We had maybe 2 hours before conditions became dangerous, and we needed to move. That's when I saw the second Heidi. Just for a moment, maybe 20 yards away, visible in the sweep of Brantley's headlamp as he adjusted his pack. A woman matching Heidi's description, same jacket, same build, standing at the edge of our light. I called out, my team turned, and the figure was gone. "Did you see that?" I asked. Moshe nodded. Brantley said, "Thought I saw someone, yeah." Heidi, the one with us, started backing away. "That's me," she said. "That was me. I'm there, so how am I here? What did you do?" She was hyperventilating now, panic setting in, and Ronan moved to calm her, but she pushed him away. "I didn't call for rescue. I never called. I was never lost. But I'm there. I saw myself. I'm standing right there." The temperature dropped noticeably, the kind of sudden shift that means weather's turning bad. We needed to extract immediately. But Heidi was becoming combative, insisting she needed to get to the other her, that she couldn't leave without understanding what was happening. I made the call to physically guide her if necessary. We had authority to compel cooperation in life-threatening situations. But as Moshe and Brantley moved to take her arms, she stopped resisting and pointed. The other Heidi was back, closer now, maybe 10 feet away. She looked solid, real, just as confused as the one we'd found. She was saying something, but no sound came out, mouth moving in what looked like our names. Then another Heidi appeared, and another, emerging from the darkness like they'd been there all along waiting to be seen. 5, 6, maybe more, all slight variations, different expressions, different postures, but all identifiably the same person. The Heidi with us screamed. It was raw, primal, the sound of someone's reality breaking apart. The other versions moved closer, surrounding us, and they all had the same expression now. Confusion turning to recognition, turning to horror. They were all reacting to seeing each other, all experiencing the same existential terror simultaneously. Moshe grabbed one arm, Brantley took the other, and I shouted for everyone to move. We ran, dragging Heidi, crashing through underbrush, following the GPS track back toward the trail. Behind us, I could hear footsteps, multiple sets, pacing us. Every time I looked back, there were more of them. A dozen versions of the woman we were rescuing, all following, all reaching toward us. We made it back to the established trail, and the footsteps stopped. I did a head count. 4 team members, 1 subject, everyone accounted for. The versions had stopped at some invisible boundary, and when I shined my light back, they were standing in a line at the edge of darkness, watching us leave. Heidi had stopped screaming and gone completely silent, catatonic, letting us guide her like a sleepwalker. The extraction took 3 hours through worsening weather. Heidi didn't speak, didn't respond to questions, just walked mechanically between Moshe and Brantley. We got her to the trailhead, into a support vehicle, transported to the hospital for evaluation. She was admitted for observation, treated for exposure and shock, and released 2 days later with no memory of the rescue or what happened in the forest. Here's the part that keeps me awake. Her car was at a different trailhead, exactly where she'd said it would be, 2 miles from where she insisted she'd been. Her hiking log showed she'd completed her route, signed out at the trailhead at 4:45 p.m. 8 minutes after we received her distress call. Traffic camera footage confirmed a vehicle matching her registration, leaving the area at 5:02 p.m. while we were still en route to rescue her. We rescued someone who was never lost. We brought back a version of Heidi who insists she was on trail, whose alternate self made it safely to her car and went home. The distress signal was real. The GPS coordinates were accurate. But the person we saved shouldn't have needed saving because she was never in danger. Unless there were two of her, or more, scattered across different versions of that trail, and we happened to find the one who got stuck. I still do rescue work, still respond to calls, still follow coordinates into the wilderness. But I check now, more carefully than before, to make sure the person I'm rescuing is the only version of them in the area. Because some rescues have a price, and sometimes bringing someone back means leaving another version behind. Still lost, still calling for help that will never come, existing in the gaps where reality splits and search and rescue protocols have no procedures. If these stories have left you unsettled, if you're lying awake wondering what lurks in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, then you're exactly where you need to be. These aren't just tales. They're warnings, documentations of the impossible, reminders that the wilderness holds secrets we're only beginning to understand. Join our community of horror seekers at Verified Fears, where we explore the true tales that keep you looking over your shoulder and questioning what's real. Subscribe, and never miss a haunting story from the places where nature and nightmare converge.